Look at a piece of work, such as your book, from my research perspective, what I'm interested in is what does this tell us about the linkages between parties and about individuals and those they're intended to represent. And for me, in my research background, that linkage, the main mechanism for that sort of responsiveness or representation is through elections. And I have to say that last week was in Brussels. It was an end-of-project meeting where we were discussing the results from our last European election study that we did on the 2009 election. And then I was reflecting upon, no, actually it's the culmination of 10 years of my research. We're starting with the 1999 European election, going through the 2004, and then continuing on with the 2009 election. And since I view any sort of work through the lens of elections, I was very pleased to see that almost you had really broken down the book into a story about an election happened, and this is in terms of policy. This is what was able to happen. It's not, I mean, you break it down in the more important years, or where more has happened into further chapters, but it always starts with a story about an election, and even the discussion of leadership and how you got a liberal leader is in terms of the size of the win in the last election and what sorts of, what that allows the party or the group to demand in terms of concessions. So there is this, even though the book really is about policy and what you're able to achieve in terms of ideas, it does start from a story about elections. Okay, that's the way I would tell it. That is a linkage then between institutions such as elections and policies or ideas. So my questions, and these are just asking you from your perspective to reflect upon them, and some of them you've already talked about, like electoral reform. But in terms of, as I said, the conference I was at last week was a culmination of a research project about European elections. We received a sizable bit of money to study elections. Colleagues who study other types of elections and other things always point out the fact that we get an awful lot of money to study elections that don't seem to matter a whole lot and are not driven by European issues, but are driven actually by national conditions. So that's sort of one tension I think I would like you to talk about is this. You know, there are some very important policies at the European level, but here we are, and you mentioned, you know, but voters still to this day decide, though there is some change with growing powers of parliament, still to this day decide in European elections, first of all, whether to vote or not, based on national conditions, and then to some extent, the party that they vote for is based on national considerations and how the national government is performing. Not how the European Parliament is performing, not how their particular MEP is performing, or about the particular successes and policy successes of a party group. It's driven by national conditions. So there is a tension there. And so how that plays out then in terms of the relationship between the European party and the European party blocs and national parties in both informal and formal ways. You tell a story in the book about how you were involved in the discussions about leadership change with the UK Liberal Party. And I see that's an informal way, a mechanism of developing a relationship between the European party level, or the supranational party level, and the national party level. But there are more formal, particularly since the Lisbon Treaty, more formal ways in which national parliaments may play a role. But what is the role of national parties? Second, and that I think also asks is a question about the representational function of supranational parties. If we know that voters are responding to national issues, how is that representational function fulfilled at the supranational level? Particularly when important policy decisions are made at the national level. Okay, and then just two more specific questions. No, one question about the electoral, or one follow-up comment about electoral reform. There's two stories that political scientists like to tell about electoral reform. One is that when electoral reforms happens at the national level, when institutions such as electoral systems change, what it is, it's reflecting changes that have already occurred in society. Particular cleavages emerge that were not there before. The dimensions which become important to people and parties change, and simply then institutions change to reflect that. The other story that institutionalists like to change is that the institutions change, and then people change or parties change and follow along. But it seems to me the story that you're telling about electoral reform at the supranational level is that the groundwork is in place for these transnational party lists and for supranational parties to emerge. And then when they do emerge and do contest elections in this way, when there is a mixed system of supranational lists, that will then filter down to people and the choices that they make at elections. And they'll become more European-based, and the direct link between them and what happens at the European level will be clear. It won't be so obscure. So I'd like just your idea of what you think in terms of the story about electoral reform at the European level might be. Driven by what's already on the ground, or do the institutions need to be in place before voters and citizens can respond? And finally, it's just a comment that you made, and this is what I had written down in a reflection from the conference last week. One of the questions that we asked is, well, one way to make elections and the parliament, elections more European focused and the parliament more responsive to citizens and more representative, to reduce the democratic deficit, is to make campaigns more about Europe. Okay? Now, if the candidates are out campaigning for election to the European Parliament, yet they are largely inexperienced because they are new, and this is probably truer of, we can't say newer member states anymore because they're not new, but those who have joined more recently, inexperienced candidates who are out there campaigning, they don't know what to say about Europe. They don't know how to run a European-focused campaign. So, you know, it's a lot to expect that campaigns are focused on European issues when we've got candidates out there who don't know what the European Parliament is about, etc., so how they can campaign. So I was struck when you said that 50%, half, and I assume this is within your group, are actually focused on a career in the European Parliament.
It's across all groups.
Across all groups. Across all groups, 50%. I'm just asking, I would like, where do we, because we did a survey of candidates in our study, and I was maybe thinking you were basing that figure on our study. No?
No. But I'd be interested to know the tallies.
Yeah, I would be interested to know what that is. And so I'd like to know what that estimate is based on, because I would like to compare with our data.
Sure.
But I'm sorry to interrupt. I think unfortunately there is a class that's waiting.
So Alison is negotiating 5 more minutes.
If I had known.